The economics of fracking are horrible because the cost far exceeds the benefit to GDP from burning the gas that you are fracked. So your debt in the UK will go up as a result of all this fracking. That's just on the economic side. Plus, it takes more energy to frack than you get out to burn. So strictly on the British thermal unit, the BTU equation, it's net negative. It's like ethanol. The United States is also a net negative. You don't hear much about ethanol anymore because it came and went in a flash, because it was a joke. It was just a way to churn a bunch of derivatives and energy futures contracts to make a few people rich on the commission. Similar with fracking, you've got the Big Six cartel here in the UK. They'll make a quick payday. They'll leave the mess for the government to pay. The citizens will have to have their taxes raised. They'll end up with a lot more debt, and they won't be any warmer, and the price of energy will go higher. It's a net loser. That's just on the economic side. On the ecological side, yes, it causes cancer. Okay, that's all you need to know. I mean, another part of the fraud is that the amount of money it takes to put these operations into place is well in excess of any economic gain that you could possibly realize on the opposite end of these economic operations in terms of fracking. It's an energy loser. It's more energy goes in than comes out. It's a capital loser. More capital goes in than comes out. So people load up the boat with these huge upfront fees. They put some equipment into the ground. They give some people some cancer, allegedly, wink, wink, and then they walk away and leave this eco-disaster for somebody else to pay.
Brits have a national health service. They don't care about cancer, but they do care about the house prices, and the house prices will decline by 13%. Now, the article then refers to another article from the Telegraph. This is written by Tim Morgan, who is the global head of research at Tullett Prebin from 2009 to 2013. And the article reads, Shale gas, the dot-com bubble of our times. Comment, output from shale wells declines so quickly that they will never be profitable. When investors realize this, the industry will collapse, writes Tim Morgan. So he mentions that everybody talks about the cancer, everybody talks about whoa, 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 the environmental problems, but he says not one person has he ever seen ask about the economic consequences. Doesn't make economic sense. Obviously, he has not watched the Keiser report because we've talked about this many times, and he says for Britain that it does not make sense. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for America, he said, where if people actually looked at the numbers, nobody's making money.
That's right. The economics are horrible. I mean, to compare to the dot-com bubble is a good comparison because during the dot-com bubble, you had many companies who went public that had no revenues. They had no business plan. They had no CEOs. They had no products. But Wall Street decided, let's take them public. Let's raise billions of dollars with initial public offerings for companies that don't really exist. And they all made huge amounts of fees and bonuses, and then it collapsed. With fracking, there is no revenue there. There's no there. There's no gas, there's no oil. It's a hoax. But they're going to still do deals. They're going to still pay themselves huge, incredible upfront fees. They're still going to make a killing. And again, it's going to collapse, just as the dot-com bubble collapsed.
This guy, Tim Morgan, mentions that in the United Kingdom, they're mentioning that, well, look at what happened in America. They're the Saudi Arabia of fracking natural gas, fracking oil. It's a Saudi Arabia. Well, he then goes into that. He said that's a big problem because we now have more than enough data to know what has really happened in America. Shale has been hyped, i.e. Saudi Arabia, Saudi America, and investors have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into the shale sector. If you invest this much, you get a lot of wells, even though shale wells cost about twice as much as ordinary ones. If a huge number of wells come on stream in a short time, you get a lot of initial production. This is basically what has happened in the U.S. So you get initial production, it all declines rapidly by 60% within the first year. And he mentions again, that it costs twice as much to build a normal well.
No, I think the comparison to Saudi Arabia, that's not necessarily the comparison you want to make. I mean, Saudi Arabia is an oil oligopoly monopoly where you have 5,000 princes that monopolize all the wealth and everyone else is living in abject poverty. Yes, I agree that America is heading toward a Saudi Arabian style economy where you've got a few thousand princes on Wall Street and in Silicon Valley and everyone else is living, in abject poverty. There is that wealth and income gap is approaching that of Saudi Arabia. I agree that that is true. America will become like Saudi Arabia. That is true. But they will not have the reserves of energy that Saudi Arabia have. That is false.
Well, they call it Saudi America, and again, the wells cost twice as much to drill any sort of simple mathematics, if you had the basic understanding of mathematics, you would be able to say that they're not able to compete. If it costs you twice as much to make the same product, the same barrel of oil, the same barrel of gas, it's the same exact thing around the world, you are not competing with somebody like the Middle East or Russia or Norway or the UK, where it's easier to extract. Now, he then goes on to say, comparing it to the dot-com bubble, and remember, Keiser report has warned you ahead of time. We were before anybody else on this. Now the Telegraph is warning, and the seemingly inevitable outcome for the U.S. shale industry is that once investors wise up and once the drilling sweet spots have been used, production will slump, probably peaking in 2017 to 18 and falling precipitously after that. The U.S. is already littered with wells that have been abandoned, often without the site being cleaned up. That's another thing you and I have talked about, is that part of the way the only way they're making any profit is abandoning the wells for the taxpayer to clean up.
That's exactly right. They externalize the cost, externalize the risk. They get a huge upfront fee. They engage in a little bit of fracking that is completely unprofitable and makes no economic sense. Then they walk away from the project and they leave an ecological disaster for somebody else to clean up. That's exactly what's going to happen now. It'll happen in the UK. In the UK, house prices will crash, and they'll blame it on frackers, they'll blame it on terrorists, they'll blame it on everybody else but themselves when they have themselves to blame. Osborne and Cameron and Mark Carney, we told you 3 years ago that fracking was going to cause economic blight and real estate crash, and they won't admit the fact that we begged them not to do it. They'll blame somebody else. They'll scapegoat somebody else, as they always do. They never take responsibility for their own ill-advised policies.
Now, you were involved in the dot-com bubble, and they're comparing this to the dot-com bubble and crash. He's saying that we have 2 more years for it to peak, so it could still go parabolic. I mean, there could still be money to be made. Suckers are losing 50 cents on every single dollar they invest, but they're still pouring money into it. So there could still, you know, theoretically, if you want to get involved in this sort of gambling, you could either go to Vegas, Macau, or you could invest in a fracking well. But there still could be money to make before it collapses precipitously.
Right. Well, the thing about bubbles bursting is you want to be a day early, not a day late. Because once the bubble bursts, all the exits are shut. So it's like screaming fire at a movie theater. You know, there's mass panic for the exits, and there's a lot of trampling, and a lot of people get hurt. So if you have 18 months or 24 months left in the bubble, then clearly you want to scale out. You want to get out. You want to start heading for the exits now before the mad rush when they finally say, you know what, this whole thing's been a hoax, as Max and Stacy have been saying all these years, and there's mass panic.
Well, I'm getting the frack out of here, Max.
Yeah, let's get the frack out of here.
And that is drillers piling up more debt than oil hunting fortunes in shale. So a decade into a shale boom that has made fracking a household word and Floyd Wilson a rich man, drillers are propping up the dream of U.S. energy independence with a mountain of debt. As oil production hits a 28-year high, investors and politicians are buying into the vision of a domestic energy renaissance. So they're focusing on this guy, Floyd Wilson, who's the CEO of Halcon. He's made a lot of money in fracking in the past, and now he's a CEO of this new company. And they say that companies are paying a steep price for the gains. Like Halcon, most are spending money faster than they made it. An average of $1.17 for every dollar earned in the 12 months ended on June 30th. Only 7 of the U.S. firms listed in Bloomberg Intelligence's E&P index made more money in that time than it cost them to keep drilling.
We've been talking about this for a couple of years now. The economics of the fracking industry are hellacious. It costs more then you profit. You can't continue a business like this. The only thing that's increasing is the debt load.
Exactly, and it's all junk rated, by the way. They're financing all of this debt with junk bonds. So they mentioned that they owed $190.2 billion at the end of the June, which is up from $140 billion at the end of June 2011. So,
well, again, this is what happens when the central bank brings interest rate to 0. So here you have a junk-rated paper based on a fracking industry that's not profitable, that can only go one way, and that's into the toilet. But the stockbroker that calls up the pension fund that needs 6 or 7 or 8% to give their retirees the guaranteed income that they signed on to on the annuity or some other contract, they'll buy this junk on this fracking industry. Of course, it's going to go bankrupt, and pension scheme will go belly up, and then you'll have a whole bunch of people on the street saying, oh, I lost my pension, and then the government will say, well, you win some, you lose some. We engineered the crisis. We supported the frackers. We knew it was economically unviable. We don't have any responsibility for your pension, even though we give it a AAA rating, and, you can go pound sand.
Well, these are junk bond rated. They're junk rated. So what they're doing, of course, a lot of the subprime mortgage in the original subprime mortgage crisis were junk rated as well. But the CDO, they were packaged into CDOs by the likes of Goldman Sachs, and then they were sold to pension funds. So there will be a layer of fraud within this. They're not directly selling to pension funds, but of course, pension funds will be those that owe it. And now one of the things that they're able to get away with, how they keep on raising money, is you have the difference between proved reserves and resource potential. So the SEC itself, if you go to the SEC, but most investors, most fools don't want to hear the bad side of the story. So they will not go to the SEC and look at the actual filings with the SEC. The SEC forbids companies from making resource potential claims in official reserves reports to them. However, the agency doesn't regulate what companies say at investor conferences, in press releases, or on their website. No one does. So they're allowed to say their resource potential, and it would often be 66 times more than what they report to the SEC for their reserves. But discrepancies between proved reserves and resource potential are common in the industry, and investors can get duped, said Ed Hers, a managing director at Houston-based Hillhouse Resources, an independent energy company, who also teaches energy economics at the University of Houston. He says, quote, there's a lot of ways to make money in the oil and gas business, and not all of them involve drilling for oil. You just drill investors' pocketbooks. When investors are willing to throw money at you, you can just make money on that. It's a time-honored tradition.
Well, it's been true for 20 or 30 years. But in the oil industry, there is some economics to the oil industry. It is a highly dense material that does have a potential as an energy source greater than the whale oil that it substituted, 100 years ago. But in the fracking industry in America, in fact, the density of that as an energy source is almost non-existent. The costs are beyond exorbitant. The risks are titanic. And of course, as you point out, people buying these projects never look at the prospectus, where the SEC requires the actual provable reserves, not the probable or the estimated or the I'll pick a number out of my ear reserves. Nobody looks at the prospectus. When I was working on Wall Street, the saying was, if anybody looked at prospectuses, if hookers had to show clients prospectuses, nobody would get laid. I mean, that was kind of a crude version of this story, but nobody looks at the prospectus. Nobody looks at what the SEC is actually required to include as the actual numbers, because they're sold these products by salesmen who are completely unregulated, who call up these pension funds and they'll say, you need, here's 4%, it's junk. But and then they'll pull in a wild card. They'll say, like, I don't know, I'm not so keen on buying junk. And then the salesman will say, you don't want those terrorists to win, do you? You don't want the terrorists to win. You better buy this fracking junk bonds, or the terrorists are going to win. And pretty soon it's all about fighting the terrorists, and then you got some poor pension fund manager like, okay.
Yeah, but these are at investor conferences, which are very often held in Vegas, by the way, in places like that. So people are drunk. They're
known for prostitution. Again, if they carried prospectuses, Vegas would die.
Well, and the same thing, again, it ties in exactly with these lowering standards for the, government-backed loans, the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac-backed loans for mortgages in America. They're reducing that. If anybody actually looked at it, they would realize it's all going to pop. Here in this story, they do interview a guy, a money manager, Tim Gravamovich, who says, I have lent money to nobody in this space, and I don't plan to. The thing is absolutely going to blow sky high, because, of course, he's an investor who is, doesn't want to lose his own money. So he looks at the SEC reports and he goes, whoa, this hooker is ugly.